Okay, welcome everyone to the Good Systems Postdoc Interest Group Research Presentation Series. This is the third presentation in our series. I'm Tara Zimmerman, a CI 2020 postdoctoral fellow working with Ken Fleischman in the I School, and I am honored to introduce to you today my fellow postdoc, James Hodges. James studies the history and materiality of digital evidence with a particular focus on archives and preservation. He is currently M. Ballard Postdoctoral Research Fellow at Houston in the I School and an incoming senior book review editor for Information and Culture. He's also an Andrew Junior Fellow in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. James earned his PhD from Rutgers University in 2020, and his talk today is entitled Supporting Medical Maintenance Labor Under the Epistemic Conditions of COVID-19. So we will have time for questions after James's presentation, so please jot down your notes and have those ready. Feel free to turn your cameras off and please mute your microphones during the presentation. And now, James, I will go ahead and you.
Hey everyone, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming. I know it's a really busy week, like wrapping up the end of the semester, so seeing any faces out there is really worth a lot to me. And I'm excited to share this work for a few reasons. I'm gonna work on sharing my screen. There we go. How's it looking? Can I get a thumbs up or a, hey, thank you very much, Christina. Okay, so as I was saying, I'm excited to share this for two reasons. Number one, because this is one of the bigger projects that I've worked on for the last several months since I joined UT. And number two, because I just published this in JSIST. And so I really want to solicit everyone's advice and questions and sort of probing discussions about what could come next. What can we do with these methods? What can we do in this subject matter area? So now, without further ado, I just want to thank a few people before I get into everything so that I don't forget later. Thanks to Tara and Ken for everything you do, organizing this and everything with Good Systems, as well as the people who just helped me out with this project when I was getting it off the ground. So Kieran Trace and Dean Eric Meyer and Amelia Acker all gave me some good advice early on. Tony Grubasek organized some colloquium events where I got some feedback. And then the people who participated in the study, I want to mention that from the beginning, iFixit.com, the maintainers, listserv, and maintenance workers all over the place. So that's what we're talking about, supporting medical maintenance labor. And part of what I'm doing while I talk about that labor is trying to develop a new conceptual model that I'm calling layered temporality. And I'll get into what that is very soon. And suffice to say right now, since we're doing this all as part of the Good Systems initiative, I just want to flag the fact that I think what I'm doing here intersects with some of the research happening around UT in topics like the future of work, especially medical work in this case, and public interest technology. We'll be talking a little bit about intellectual property and technology in the public interest as we get further in as well. So let's talk about what we're doing. Oh yeah, and by the way, go read it in JSIST, it's there. So what I'm doing here today is I'm looking at some documents that were circulated among biomedical equipment repair technicians, and I'm trying to develop that conceptual model that I mentioned. Basically what I'm arguing is that there's this sort of multi-layered temporality in healthcare and in professional communities. And in order to sort of arrive at this idea, I used methods that were informed by enumerative bibliography, in other words, sort of counting and quantifying the characteristics of certain texts, and also digital forensics. So I'm looking at overlapping qualities in these documents related to when they were made, what format they were made and how they changed over the course of their life cycle. And what the findings are going to show is that these manuals tend to travel through several steps of mediation in between the time of their initial publication and then their eventual usage by technicians. And in developing a model that sort of accounts for this, what I want to do is contribute to the study of working professionals' personal information practices, which hopefully then can get us going with a more accurate assessment of the information needs associated with these particular professional communities, in this case, those who maintain medical equipment. So the corpus that I use in this study came from iFixit.com's medical device repair collection. I guess I was just showing a screen cap from an article about this project that we did, where we processed, me and a team of about 200 volunteer archivists, over 10,000 repair manuals. And they were contributed by working technicians from around the world, and then we processed them. And it was all done in response to the strain that was placed on medical facilities during the COVID pandemic. Now, what I'm looking at in particular, in terms of the corpus, is the respiratory analyzer subcategory of documents, which are, as you might imagine, very important in monitoring the status of patients who are hospitalized with lung problems during the pandemic. So there's 40 documents associated with this category in the collection, and I look at them and I quantify them in the classification step you see there based on their properties that I can sort of identify. Things like the publication date, the status of the original paper copies, version of PDF used to encode them, and any other metadata that might be there in the XMP metadata platform, which we'll talk about a bit soon. And after I looked at these bibliographic characteristics, then I started to recognize patterns in the findings, which helps to develop that conceptual model I was talking about. And then finally, I compare it against historical sources, which in this case are largely technical documentation of the PDF format itself. So those are the 4 steps we're talking about: retrieving the sources, classifying them according to their properties, identifying patterns in those properties, and then doing the historical inference in order to contextualize the findings. So I classified the documents first in terms of their print characteristics and then in terms of their digital characteristics. And that's where I started to notice things about when they were from and the revision history, as well as how they were scanned. And I can just mention here that I did sort of an open coded framework with theoretical sampling. So I kept looking through data until no more categories were coming out, and the categories that that had been previously identified achieved saturation. And I can talk more about that if people want to get methodological in the Q&A. Now, of course, this format here is informed by digital forensics, which are a set of techniques that originate within law enforcement and legal discovery, but are nowadays increasingly employed within archival processing as well, so that we can do things like detect potentially sensitive information or ensure that objects haven't been altered during handling. So these kinds of techniques can also then note details in an object's production and circulation processes, like how it was treated over the course of its lifespan. Even in some cases, this is where it's really useful, where those features aren't acknowledged in extant documentation. So as a result, the sort of forensic approach here constitutes what I would say is a valuable way of recovering knowledge about behaviors that have already taken place or that have taken place in contexts where observation might encounter problems, say related to access, intellectual property, privacy, safety, things of that nature. So in the case of biomedical maintenance, you could imagine that there are safety issues, especially during the pandemic. You could also imagine that there's some argument to be made for trying to study these things unobtrusively, right? One thing that I found here that was interesting is that the manuals came from technicians who were operating in a really wide variety of geographical contexts, and information was getting shared across political borders. Now, these conditions were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and as a result, I would say the information practices of biomedical repair technicians are a great candidate for this sort of forensic approach. Now, existing conceptual models in this area have been pretty successful in creating guidelines for collection creation, as in looking forward, and they've been good at sort of crafting official government and NGO responses to events where people do want to sort of keep records, or where record keeping or information resources become very important. However, there's been less research on peer-to-peer or distributed efforts. So a lot of research on government response, not as much on individual response or community response. There are some exceptions, and it's a growing body of literature. Howard Besser's work from 2013 on creating an archive of digital materials related to the Occupy movement was pretty useful here. And he does note some important characteristics of these types of sort of dynamic historical unfolding events, where he says, and I'm quoting here, there's no easy way to control for quality, file format, or metadata, end quote, in these types of situations. And I would say, there are clear parallels between these emergent qualities in Occupy, as well as those in a sort of ad hoc response to crisis. But Besser's solution there is about developing, and I'm quoting again, smart ways to harvest metadata and analyze files, as well as to influence the behavior of potential contributors. And that last part, I think, is really key here, to influence the behavior. I think what I'm trying to do here is not to influence the behavior. I'm not going to purport to think that I can tell biomedical technicians how to do their jobs. However, what I do think we can do is understand their behavior, model their existing information practices as opposed to their potential practices. And we can use models like Besser's as a heuristic for planning and processing, again, looking forward. But what I'm trying to do is do something that looks backwards so that we can better understand practices that already exist. And this is where something like Megan Finn's work, which you see on the slide here, come into play as well. So in her book, Documenting Aftermath, she has a really useful concept of an information infrastructure, which she describes as, and I'm quoting, the many different institutions, technologies, and practices that characterize how groups of people produce and share information, as well as exercise power and control. Now, this model does capture some of the really emergent qualities of a disaster or an emergency, but however, it is still looking generally at the larger scale and institutional responses, where I'm hoping to get more localized and look at these sort of key classes of essential workers as opposed to response writ large. Now, I also want to make a quick note here while I'm in the sort of method and theory section about intellectual property and epistemology. I can't say that the information practices I'm recovering or highlighting here are the result of COVID, strictly speaking. In fact, most of the files and the findings that I'm looking at were generated before COVID. So what I'm saying instead is that the epistemic conditions of COVID changed our relationship to these documents and changed our relationship to things like intellectual property. In other words, the epistemic changes of COVID are what made this study possible, even though the study does not necessarily spend all of its time looking at the particularities of COVID itself or response to COVID itself. But some of these changes that have happened to enable this study are, for example, politicians became a lot more supportive of right to repair legislation, and companies got a little bit less litigious. So this is why a site like iFixit, who we were working with on this project, and the technicians who contributed all their files became a bit more emboldened. And that's kind of why we were able to do all this. So basically what I'm saying is that the epistemic changes of COVID made the study possible. Okay, so what you see here is the beginning of the case study itself. This is the top level directory of the respiratory analyzer files. You can see there's 11 subfolders that contain about 40, not about, literally 40 exactly files documenting the operation and the maintenance of devices that are quite crucial if we're trying to monitor patients' lung function. So what I did here, again, is I look at the metadata to try and reconstruct some of the personal information practices of the technicians who work with these files. So overall, PDF versions that were used in the files ranged from version 1.2, which was current from 1996 to 2000, all the way up to version 1.7, which has been current from 2006 to the present. PDF standards 1.2 and 1.3 are used for 9 documents each, which means a total of 45% of documents are using either 1.2 or 1.3. Version 1.4 accounts for an additional 2. I know I'm just throwing numbers out here, but the important thing to note here is that when you add all of that up, over half of the files are using outdated standards. And in many cases, these things have been discontinued for like well over a decade. 1 in 4 files is using a version of PDF that's separated from the stated date of publication from that document by more than a decade as well. So you can see that there's really a lot of old technology that's still in use. And I think that's important to highlight in the findings here. You know, in a field that is constantly subject to changing conditions, it's worth remembering that people operating within a global context are still collecting and trading documents for all kinds of old devices using old computers and old hardware and old software. So the sort of temporal components of biomedical repair, I think, need to be understood as being unevenly distributed. So documents and files and operating systems are all these sort of haphazard conditions of old, or combinations of old and new technologies. Also, I guess I want to notice that 7 of the 40 files contain handwritten annotations. That's just shy of 20%. So I'll be highlighting a bit more of that in a minute. And right now, I'll just point you, if you want to hear more about the sort of like corpus level breakdown of all this, read the JSIST article. I can send you a PDF or a link or whatever, because I discuss it in a little bit more detail. But right now, I think it might be best if I switch over to a sort of zoomed in example, like a critical case study of one document that really shows all of this stuff in action. So what you see here is the iFixit collections copy of the Novometric 7000 respiratory analyzer, with its front page listing a publication date of July 20th, 1989. The second page has this list of handwritten notes where they're talking about maintenance costs and part numbers, reminding us that this is a living document, right? There's marginalia that's used to enhance its usefulness in the field. And these handwritten notes are also an example of that sort of multi-layered temporality again. It's pervasive. So in the course of a career, a technician collects and works on documents from a variety of times and places, and they adapt the documents as time goes on. So, you know, another tick in the box for that heterogeneity of this field that I'm talking about. Another thing we can note here is the XMP metadata from this particular PDF file, which gives us another layer of depth to our findings. So despite the fact that this document was purported to be published in 1989, the digital file was actually generated in 2020 using version 1.7 of the PDF standard, which itself, goes back to 2018, just in case anyone is curious. The metadata also shows that the file was created using contemporary command line tools called Pike PDF and Tesseract, which you can see there, highlighted in green. So using these command line tools shows a certain degree of technical proficiency in the production and the circulation of this particular document, which isn't necessarily shared by all of the collection materials. So that's another thing worth emphasizing. This particular document shows the presence of all these, tools and inscriptions, but some of them are maybe more telling in their absence. So a lot of the other documents were made using really default out-of-the-box programs like Apple Preview, the stock viewer from Macintosh's operating systems. Another thing to note is that this XMP metadata that we see, which was generally adopted by the PDF format in version 1.4, 2001, nevertheless, only a small handful of the files actually use this capability to transmit some metadata. So it shows another sort of the heterogeneity where the document has this long life cycle and it's constantly being changed in the forms of both its hand annotations and in its digital encoding. And in contrast against some of the other documents that we might look at, we're reminded that there are varying degrees of technical proficiency as well and access to hardware and software, as I sort of mentioned earlier. So based on all these findings, I propose this model of layered temporality. And it includes 4 steps where interventions change document forms and contents. So multiple copies of the same document can diverge at any point in this life cycle, which leads in some cases to multiple copies of the same document, which each still possess meaningful differences in terms of additional or subtracted information that has changed over time. And again, if you want to hear more about that, we can talk about it in Q&A, or you can read the JSIST article because there's some cool examples of that as well. But to get back to the model, more specifically, the steps of intervention are the initial publication, the print annotations, the digitization, and the porting forward into consecutive new either copies of a file or in some cases, editions of the PDF standard. So based on the evidence that the documents get altered at each step of this life cycle, which I do want to note, it isn't just linear top to bottom like that. You know, things can sort of jump around out of order at any point as well. I just wanted to give a sort of nice, clean visualization. But anyway, so what we can do is we can surmise, as I've mentioned, that the documents accrue additional meaning over time, and therefore that limiting archival resources to the collecting of, say, a single authoritative edition could actually prevent technicians from sharing potentially valuable knowledge. I think that's useful to understand if we're conceptualizing information systems that are meant to serve this community. The complex temporality of documents and technical manuals like this should then, I would say, inform design and the deployment of information systems for emergency use and for just general professional usage, so that we can more clearly guide professionals in the selection, and I mean information professionals, people like us, in the selection and the deployment of accurate and meaningful and timely documentation. And in some cases, that does mean having a more fine-grained way of understanding the differences between apparently similar documents. And so it reminds us to conclude about the ways that workplace information practices are situated and improvisational always, which is a sort of touchstone of workplace ethnographies. And workers are always responding to conditions in unpredictable ways, and none more so than COVID. This is sort of what I have learned based on my work with this particular corpus of documents. And so now I'll wrap up. I'm excited to have some Q&A, and I hope, since I've already published this, maybe you all can help me brainstorm some ideas for what to do with this method or this corpus or ways of advancing this work forward. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, James. That was fascinating. I love your work, and I have my own questions, but I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the group. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. In the meantime, if you're comfortable, turn your video back on to participate in discussion if you'd like, and we'll go from there. I don't want to take up all the time, but maybe if people are still preparing their questions. So I'm a little bit interested. I know this isn't directly what you were asking for feedback on, but I'm really interested in how you used your pre-COVID research skills and interests to pivot to this kind of work when you saw the need arise.
Yeah, sure. I can happily talk about that. So I do these sort of close forensic readings of digital sources, always in a variety of contexts. Previously, I had been mostly working in the history of computing because taking an approach like this is a really nice way to see contributions that are made by people who don't necessarily get official credit in documentation. So, you know, sometimes we see like subcontractors or an entire class of worker who was not necessarily mentioned in, you know, official promo or documentation or instructions for something. So when I volunteered to work on processing all this stuff, I naturally just wanted to kind of pick around and I wanted to compare documents, and I wanted to see what was kind of hidden in there to see if I would learn anything about biomedical maintenance labor. And as it turns out, I did. So in many ways, it's like, you know, victory for that method, for the forensic approach to looking at documents. And yeah, so I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. I think Amelia has a question.
Hi all, sorry I can't turn on my video. I'm at a desktop, but thanks, James. That was an awesome talk. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this idea about unevenly distributed documents and the future. So one thing that I've noticed in my work, when people are reading primary documents that have been digitized, they're increasingly looking at their cell phones and will occasionally like take screen grabs or partition out these longer documents for any number of reasons. But, you know, as you think about your conceptual model moving forward, you know, how are you thinking about these documents maybe getting cut apart or featured in screen grabs, or sort of like becoming new works or new sorts of objects that are excerpts, I guess is how I might describe it, and how those might live on in other lively and weird ways, whether that's misinformation or knowledge bases or FAQs and so on. So have you thought about, like, I guess, yeah, excerpts, and then maybe how these documents feature into new sort of screen environments, particularly smaller mobile devices? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in this case, the sort of unit analysis is still the document, we could call it, or the manual maybe is better, because document is almost too general, right? I mean, even one page or one excerpt is still a document, especially in a digital setting. So, you know, the manual is largely the unit of analysis in this particular case. But I take your point very well that the unit of analysis in other contexts, especially if we were to be looking at people, say, in situ, like when they're in the workplace, is going to be largely mobile, and in many cases it may be an excerpt of strictly the most relevant or most misleading, or whatever it may be, part. So one thing that actually I've been doing in that area of working with a screen grab as the unit of analysis is work with a co-author that I guess I won't name too much about it because it's under review at the ASIS conference right now. So we submitted a long paper. We'll see if it gets in, about just this issue, about using screen grabs and trying to see from a forensic perspective what we can gather about people's information practices when the unit of analysis is that small. And what we found is that you can learn a lot about what people do with their personal devices based on a unit of analysis that is as small as the screenshot. In many cases, there are like relics from their UI, whether it's you know, the home button or like a row of apps at the top of their screen. In many cases, you can see elements from whatever social media service they grabbed a file from. So you might see, you know, the little hearts from Instagram, or maybe you see a little toolbar from Scribd or something like that. So by looking at those sorts of things, you can get a sense for the particular information practices of the person who did that sort of like more micro level of trading of documents. And then another thing that you can do is you can quantify deterioration of the image over time. So in this paper that I'm working on with my collaborators, what we found is that JPEG compression can stack up over time. So as people screenshot and repost things, you can actually get a sense for how close or far they are from the original source based on how messed up the image is. So, you know, I haven't applied these things in the professional case. This is much more in the disinformation space, but you know, your question makes me think that moving forward, there's no reason you can't cross those streams. And so I think that could be really interesting for the future. So thanks.
Thanks, James.
Can I call on someone, Christina?
Sorry, I forgot I was muted.
No
I
problem.
said, what other questions we have? Christina.
Hello. Great talk. It's good to see you again. So whereas Amelia's question was talking about screenshots and external to the document, I was thinking actually of a physical. I know we've talked about like recipes and how, you know, we write our notes, or even there's some cues, you know, I know that this is the most, you know, we use this recipe a lot, or it's very good because I can see that it's been used quite often. But what I was thinking when you were talking is about like onboarding new people into this process. And sometimes when you're learning from someone else, there is a manual, right? But then there's also another person's set of written notes or cues that they just know to do. So how do you capture the physicality and put that into, combine it to that digital manual, if that makes sense?
I think it does. Let me rephrase and make sure I caught the question. So are you asking about the physicality of the documents? In other words, how do we sort of understand changes that have been made to pieces of paper over time?
Yeah, and bringing them together as one collection.
Got it. Yeah, that is something that we noticed. So another thing that I mentioned a little bit more in the full article is a few examples where people appended new pages to a document. they hand wrote something and stapled it in, or they had, in some cases, there are pages that seem to have been printed out by like a vendor or a maintenance contractor and then attached to a manual. So it's like not in the same font. It doesn't have the same pagination. In those cases, I mean, does that fully capture the, you know, unique situated tacit knowledge of the person working with that thing? Probably not. However, one thing we can still do is at least try to capture that to the extent that we can by not just getting rid of files that appear to be similar. So another thing that I do in the full article is compare a few instances where it appears that we have multiple copies of the same document, but we can notice those things that have been added onto the end, the handwriting. In some cases, you can just like run like a hash and just see that there's something computationally different. So maybe that doesn't need to be made available to everyone. It may not be meaningful semantic difference, but it does at least give us a sense of how many different people are using a manual like this. So maybe one sort of answer that I think could drive some archivists nuts would be save more, like just save more stuff, even things that appear to be the same, save them anyway, if storage will allow. I mean, hey, blocks, right? Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So it may just be that old adage.
Yeah, space is a big issue, isn't it?
Right. And especially with, I mean, in an immediate sense with printed documents, digital documents, it's like we can kick it down the road for a while until we have like massive ecological and resource problems that force us to reevaluate how much we've been keeping.
Thank you.
I think Aisha has a question.
Hey, sorry, it's really loud here, so I'm typing it in the chat.
Oh, I see it. Great. So Aisha says, really interested in the ways that your material moves from digital to non-digital and vice versa. Thank you. The concept of layer temporality integrates printed and manuscript and digital materials across the life cycle. So what does it tell us about the information practices? I think the heterogeneity is the big thing I want to emphasize there. The intertwining of print and digital, I think in a lot of sort of studies of textual cultures, people still have a tendency, even after all these years, to think of things as being either or, you know, either it's printed or it's digital. Once it's digitized, you don't need the print anymore. Or once you have a digital copy, every other print copy, you can just get rid of it because we have an authoritative digitized copy. I think the important thing to note here is that any digitization project or digital management project is still going to be running into issues where there are unique qualities related to the site where things are happening, or people's particular usage of them, or just, you know, which one got scribbled on. And understanding that sort of intertwining, that imbrication, I think is really crucial if we want to support any sort of work that happens in a mixed environment like this, especially if we want to be sensitive to the needs of people who perhaps do not have the resources to always be using the most frequently updated software and the up-to-date standards and the best scanners and so on and so forth. So just to emphasize that the way that these material concerns from beyond the digital space are fully penetrated and integrated within the digital world as well. It's I think, to me, the important thing is to understand that all of our usage is hybrid, is always hybridized.
I have another quick question. Are you envisioning taking this conceptual model and extending it through more like library work or an archive work, or more in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I should give it some more thought. I mean, so it's something that I sort of worked on to understand the workplace. So I think that's where its sort of first calling would be, and that's certainly a place where here in information studies and information science, we do a lot of work to support work. The workplace has been historically the sort of dominant site of our research and where we often conceptualize information labor to be happening. However, another thing that we see in our literature is that in the recent decades and you know, sort in an accelerating sense, we're coming to understand that information practices and knowledge work don't just happen in the workplace. They happen at home, in the library, in the doctor's office, at school, in your hobbies, in the serious leisure field. So I think if this model is robust enough, and I think it may be, it will probably be useful in some of these other areas as well. One thing that I have noticed, so I have another article that just got accepted to Journal of Documentation, and that one is about enthusiast video game preservation. So these are non-professionals who, in a sort of serious leisure sense, take care of old files for fun, basically. And the materials that they work with are layered in pretty much the same way. They can be ported forward in a variety of ways. So they have the sort of forking paths into newer and slightly varied conditions. You know, they're developed in some cases in print and then digitized. And so it is that same sort of hybrid area where, or hybrid model where people are, you know, hand drawing things and then scanning them and then adapting them to a digital format. So I would say, at least, you know, that one's fresh in my mind in the sort of serious leisure context. I think the same model generally works there. And I guess I am pretty interested in thinking of new places to try and apply it and see what we get, because I'm sure it could be refined. So yeah, any interesting case studies that you all want to toss my way, let me know.
Yeah, it seems like I have different application possibilities. That's super interesting.
Thanks.
Anybody have any other questions? Probably got time for one more. If not, I'm super interested in the other study that you just mentioned that you were working on, the deterioration of a JPEG. Did you say, did I understand you right, that you were using that to track misinformation?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, people love hearing about that one. So I hope it gets in and I can like not be cagey about it. But yeah, so I did that with a co-author, Mitch Chiat. I'll just kind of spill the beans. Hopefully none of you are reviewing it for ASIST. If you are, I don't know, you can recuse yourself and tell someone else to do it. Maybe, hey, you don't want to review stuff anyway, right? So yeah, it's with this guy, Mitch Chiat, who is a UT alum. He works at Harvard now. He actually co-authored some things with Amelia, so I bet she knew what I was talking about when I said that. We use this algorithm that guy Alan Bovic from the School of Engineering developed. He did it to evaluate just the general visual quality of visual media online, and so people use it, for example, to like see how good a stream is from Amazon or see how good your YouTube video looks or whatever. But we sort of tinkered with it with a MATLAB script that they make available, and we reverse engineered it with one of his grad students, this guy Praful Gupta. And yeah, we got it to tell us sort of which images are closer or further from the source. So if during a disinformation event, which is the case study that we used, basically you can grab examples from around the net and say, and sort of get a more robust timeline by saying how many times they've been copied and what methods have been used to copy, as opposed to just saying, you know, it was reposted 1,000 times. Well, instead we can say, you know, if we take representative slices from various points, we can get an idea that, you know, the one appearing on Twitter 36 hours later actually is closer to the source from Parler the earlier day. So we know there's one vector that went straight from Twitter to Parler versus the, you know, the 15th retweet that got screen capped on 4chan. We can see it deteriorated really widely. So it was circulating heavily in that particular vector. And we can kind of make a little family tree, like a genealogical idea of where misinformation comes from. Of course, it works with screen caps. It's not going to work with everything. But yeah, you know, increasingly people do use screen caps to share things in the heat of a moment. So yeah, one interesting way of kind of just fingerprinting, seeing where stuff has come from and where it's going.
Yeah, the fingerprint, I think is really smart, because I read something not too long ago about how people were moving to bring misinformation and disinformation in screenshots because they weren't traceable versus a link versus me saying it myself. If I just post a photo, it was harder for them to flag it as misinformation. So that seems like a really good step toward being able to share and being able to maybe monitor that in some sort of a different way. Interesting.
Yeah, that's our hope. And yeah, so that thing that you were mentioning about people using screen caps to evade certain kinds of content moderation. My co-author Mitch also wrote something with Amelia about that. They were looking specifically at, I believe it was not just screenshots, but screenshots that have been reposted to archive.org. So people are also using archive.org links to sort of like launder URLs that might get flagged. So yeah, in that disinformation space, Mitch is he's a guy who's coming up, and I was really happy to help out with the image compression stuff.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Good.
Hi, James. Great talk. Sorry, I couldn't have my video on earlier. Apologies for that. But so what Tara was getting at in terms of what the work that you just talked about, helping potentially people self-recognize disinformation and misinformation, is within your team that you published the paper, is there any discussion or any kind of plans, maybe making it a kind of plugin for social media sites or something like that, so that actually you could test that theory that Tara kind of mentioned or posed? Because that would be potentially a high impact in terms of, not just theoretically making a case or tracing, but actually making a utility tool from a transparency perspective out of the line of work.
Great idea. No, we hadn't really talked about that. If you saw my talk, I tend to be doing this sort of like forensic reconstruction of things. So I'm thinking of it more as like an investigator. I want to understand if something is going to pop up in court or in a history book or in important journalism. I want to say, what is the source? Is it legitimate? Who made it? Where did it come from? How many people shared it? How did they share it, et cetera? But I take the point that, I mean, the same basic approach of sort of fingerprinting things to see where they've come from could be really useful in a sort of like real-time sense. Mitch, the co-author, has been working on a tool somewhat related where you can plug a screen cap into this web app that he's building, and it tries to find the original source of that tweet. So it works with screen capped tweets. The idea being that, sometimes you see a screen cap, there's no context. You don't know if it was a troll or a comedian or someone who just changed their display name for one day and they're not actually Elon Musk or whatever. So it can help you find the URL where then you can sort of get a more fully contextual picture of where that image came from. Now, it doesn't always work yet, but he's getting there. And so that is an example of a sort of similar thing, right? Like empowering people in real time to see better, more full contextual information about where something comes from. And yeah, I mean, I think there is potential to apply that to the image compression as well. So I'll probably talk to him about that. Thank you for the suggestion.
And you said, did you say the name of the app? If I can I find it on Google by Google?
No, I don't know what they've decided to call it yet, and I don't think it's out yet. But
okay. Do you keep us posted once it comes, if you know of it coming out?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the guy's name is Mitch Chaiet, Chaiet. If you track him down, he's a research assistant at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, and he's always kind of posting his tinkering and stuff. So you can find him and see what he's been up to, I'm sure.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you.
No problem.
Well, I'll wrap us up. I think we're a little bit over time, but thank you so much again, James, and thank you to all of you who attended. It was great having you here. Please make a note, join us on May 8th for our next presentation in our series, and I will actually be sharing my work then on social noise and the technological agency of Facebook users. So thanks to everybody for being here, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.